Well, hello and good evening, everybody. I'm Michael Banister. I'm going to talk about my novel, Around the Horn and Back. I've written, I think, 4 novels and some stories. And just to give you a brief introduction of how I got started writing, my experience, first of all, my experience as a Peace Corps volunteer in East Africa was really sort of like it laid the groundwork for the kind of environment that I wanted to explore in this book. This book takes place on the Horn of Africa, which includes Somalia and part of Sudan and part of Ethiopia and part of Kenya. It's a big region. So I traveled quite a ways around the Horn of Africa for a couple of years when I lived up there. I never made it to Somalia, though. I had planned to, but it got a little scary and didn't make it. After that, after the Peace Corps, I lived in Tunisia for a couple of months studying Arabic. And then after that, I lived in Turkey for 2 years as a librarian working for Robert College of Istanbul. So the combination of those experiences made me want to sort of get down and include those experiences to color the writing that I was about to start on. I had to retire from my practice as a lawyer in 2011 because the writing that I was doing as a lawyer was very kind of boring, shall we say. And it was aimed at a certain audience that I wanted to persuade about a certain position. So I wanted to get away from all of that and write stuff that would be open to a lot of interpretations and a lot of experiences. So I started writing short stories and a couple of novellas. And then in 2019, I started writing a couple of novels. The current one, this one, Around the Horn and Back, is really, I guess you would have to call it a sequel, even though it's the first one that I've published. I originally wrote a kind of a novella, I guess you would call it, about 20 or 30 pages long, that was sort of a precursor to this. It sort of gave the sort of background of the characters and the events that are going to take place in this book. I didn't like the way that one was written, so I pulled it off the Amazon where it was, and I chucked a lot of stuff and changed everything around. And after about a year and a half, I came up with this one, and I'm really pleased with it. Then I went back and I've rewritten the sort of prequel to this, and I'm hoping that that one will be coming out in another month or two. I'm trying to remember how I first came up with the idea of time travel. I was always a fan of science fiction, and time travel was always something I was fascinated with. And I discovered this mariner's navigation device called a spherical astrolabe, which back in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the sailors used to use it to help them navigate the oceans all over the planet. And then when modern times came, that became a museum piece and people no longer used it. So anyway, this science fiction story, as I said, on the back of the book, I wrote the intro to it. It says, "What would you do with your dad's broken time machine? A modified spherical astrolabe. You could fix it if you had 21st century tools, but you're both in the 15th century. You could pretend it's a normal nautical device and offer it to the 15th century explorer, Vasco da Gama. But what if the Great Admiral discovers the true function of the device? How will you edit your dad's memoir to describe the astrolabe as nothing more than an ancient marine navigation device? Will your dad's wannabe time-traveling companions find the astrolabe in the future?" So basically, that sort of sets the story. The main character in this novel is the daughter of one of the members of that 21st century group who ended up traveling back into the 15th century. And her father got stranded there couldn't go back into the future because the spherical astrolabe was broken. So he ended up marrying and opening, starting a business and having a child. And the daughter's name was Alessandra, and she is the prime character in the novel. The novel starts out with her entering the University of Padua in Italy. She's the first female student at that university. And now remember, this is in the 1400s, like 1430. And so I have to also say that what we're dealing with here is a kind of, you would call it a parallel world, because these people discovered that when you travel back in time, you don't really enter the past, your own past, you enter a closely aligned past, not exactly the same. So the past that we know, the things that we know don't exist in this world. So I'm going to start reading from this section where Alessandra has graduated from the university and was hired as a professor. She's teaching English and Arabic and astronomy. So she is on her way out. She's about to retire, and one of her professors, who's the chairman of the department, comes up to her and he asks her some questions. He says, now back to this subject of astronomy. One of my professional acquaintances at the University of Krakow, that's Poland, I guess, wrote me not long ago after your presentations here last year there. He seemed to think your lectures might lead some of the students to question the wisdom of the ancients. Now, when he says wisdom of the ancients, we're talking about in the 1400s, where the view of the world as being the, just one planet out of a whole bunch, that was not the accepted, the church disapproved of that idea completely, and they would persecute people who promoted it. And so this professor Puliti is questioning Alessandra because it seemed like in her lectures, she was suggesting that the world really wasn't the center of the universe. So he asked her about that. She said, yes, in fact, one of those students came up to me and suggested that very thing, but I set him straight. I explained that my intention was to give an overview of past and current thinking on astronomy. The professor says, well, that's what my colleague said, but he seemed to be worried about what the church might think. Were you worried about that? Not at all, Professor. Some who study the ancients and some who study those who study the ancients are quite careful to avoid a direct provocation. Professor Puliti smiled and said, some scholars are very careful. I hope you are of that persuasion. Well, I must be off. I wish you the best of luck in your travels. I understand you intend to return to Mogadishu. Is that correct? Now, Alessandra was born in Mogadishu. That's where she grew up, Somalia. Yes, and I worry about the length and difficulty of the trip. Adriatic Sea, Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean. But I think it's likely the caravels will have improved greatly in the 40 years since I left. Oh, yes, they have. I have some acquaintances who own caravels. One, a very good friend, operates two that transports goods up and down the Adriatic, and occasionally he takes on passengers. Now, a caravel is kind of a small galleon, I guess you would say. It's got 4 decks. It's got it's mostly for hauling freight and goods and animals, and it has 3 cabins for people. So anyway, she talks the professor into asking if he will have room on her on his caravel, and he says he finds out that he says, yes, I was planning on paying him a visit in Venice as soon as my work here at the university is completed. For the time being, I'll be going there in a week. Thank you very much. My baggage wouldn't amount to much. A trunk of clothes and a trunk for my books and my spherical astrolabe. Ah, the spherical astrolabe. I must say, Professor, you amaze me more and more as I talk to you. I almost forgot to ask you about that device or machine, whatever it is. I understand you've used the spherical astrolabe in your lectures here and at the University of Krakow. What did you demonstrate with it? Seafaring folk have used traditional astrolabes in navigation for centuries. The Portuguese are beginning to use a more advanced device, the spherical astrolabe. My astronomy lectures will be deadly dull without a demonstration of how the modern travelers travel by the stars. Professor Politi stopped himself from pursuing the subject in more depth. He moved on to safer waters. Do you still have family in Mogadishu? You said your parents have passed on. Well, my parents and my aunt and uncle have passed on, but I still have my cousin and a few friends. I expect to see some of them after I get settled. I'm looking forward to reacquainting myself with the city. Well, as I said, or wish I had said, God be with you. And so that's basically that conversation there. And then Alessandra is sort of thinking about what she's going to do on her way back. Her father had asked her, Horacio, he's the one who came into the past with the spherical astrolabe, and then it broke and he couldn't go back. So there are two things that he wants Alessandra to return and to preserve, to keep anybody from finding out. The way that the spherical astrolabe broke was that inside this device, I don't know if I have a picture of it in the book. I can't find it at the moment, but there's a golden globe in the middle, and there are a bunch of bands that go through it, and there are markings on it, and you can rotate the globe to tell you where your position is, and you can then figure out, by the stars where you want to go. This particular astrolabe, someone, and they don't really understand who, her father never knew, and his friends, they sort of discovered this thing in a trunk in Hawaii in 2016. It had detailed instructions for how to convert this device into a time machine, and it was preset for 1500, which is eventually what they did. They went back into the past, and that's when Horacio, her father, fell and broke the machine, and he got stranded there. So the story progresses, and basically her mission, according to her father, he wants her to make sure that the astrolabe never gets found, and that the book that he wrote a memoir while he was in Somalia. He wrote sort of a history of his experiences since he arrived. And he's realized that that book has to be modified, because if anybody finds it, they'll figure out what to do with the astrolabe, and they'll convert it. So finally, he decides he wanted to tell Alessandra all about this, and about the fact that they were living in a parallel past. It wasn't the past that he had grown up reading about as a professor. So when she comes back home, her father had passed away, her mother had passed away, and she's, getting herself reacquainted in the home that she and her cousin Beatrice have inherited in Mogadishu. She discovers a letter from her dad in a desk, and she's reading it, and she's quite shaken up by it. And this is what the letter says. My dear Alessandra, if you're reading this, it means you have returned from your teaching career at the University of Padua. Your mother and I are very proud of your accomplishments, and we know you will enjoy your retirement as your cousin Beatrice's partner in running this beautiful inn. And now comes the hard part, the part I dreaded telling you all these years. Here it is in a nutshell, an expression from my world. This world you were born in is not my world. Or I should say, it is not the world I studied in my career as a history professor. You see, when my starlight commune, quote unquote, traveled back in time to 1430, we did not know that not only had we traveled back in time, but we had entered a parallel history. Our group returned to 2019 almost immediately to avoid Zheng He's crew in Mogadishu. He's a Chinese admiral, a historical figure who had a treasure fleet of dozens of ships, and they were massive things, and they explored all over the Indian Ocean and all down the coast of Africa. Some people think that a couple of his ships may have gone up the west coast of Africa and even crossed the Atlantic to the New World, but that's never been proven. Anyway, Zheng He was notorious for kidnapping experts, people he found in his travels who would help his crew do what they needed to do. So anyway, Back to the story. Our group returned almost immediately to avoid Zheng Hei's crew in Mogadishu without ever discovering what had happened. Everyone but me, that is. I was left behind. And soon I noticed things about Mogadishu that were not recorded in the history books I had studied. Not only were they not in the history books, they did not happen. That is to say that the substantial, thriving Catholic community here with its beautiful church and the substantial, thriving community of Portuguese immigrants never existed in the history of my world. You wrote us a long letter describing your 3-stage voyage on caravels and coaches to Padua. We marveled at the beauty of your writing, but you described crews on each stage that never could have existed in the past that I studied in my career. Some of your crewmen were Greek, some were Abyssinian, some were Slavic, some were Nordic, and some were even Italian. When I was researching the Middle East in my career, I learned that such diverse crews did not exist. Genoese, Venetians, and Turks controlled the Mediterranean. Arabs controlled the Red Sea. The Indian Ocean simply didn't have European ships before Vasco da Gama rounded Africa and sailed up and east to India. The biggest shock for me, though, but not for your mother, was that not only did the university admit you, a Portuguese woman from Mogadishu, as a student, but it later hired you as a professor. In the parallel world I lived in before coming here, those early universities did not even admit women as students, let alone hire them as professors, at least not until the 17th century. Of course, I knew nothing about the events you must have experienced after my passing. When you were growing up, I described the only near future I knew. Ahmad Granj war with Abyssinia, Vasco da Gama's journey to India. I even told you the date that da Gama would anchor just out of sight of the port of Mogadishu. I do not know whether or not those historical events will come true in your world. Perhaps parallel worlds are not necessarily completely different from one another. On the day that your mother and I dropped you off at the port to begin your voyage to Padua, I had a vision that the book I entrusted you with would not remain in the archive of the Zela Mosque. It would be taken by Ahmad Gran as a talisman he hoped would ensure his success in his war against Abyssinia. But his hopes would be dashed, he would be killed, and the book would travel into the future from that point on. It would end up in Hawaii to be found in the 21st century by my former colleague, João da Gama, and our Starlight Commune. I realized only then that the book must be altered in such a way that the future Starlight Commune will not consider it as anything other than an interesting artifact. I should have realized at the outset that if the Starlight Commune obtained the unedited book and managed to follow the time travel directions for repairing the spherical astrolabe, they might travel back in time and create a never-ending loop. The note you appended to it must be removed, and all references to the astrolabe as a time machine must also be removed. As I write this, I of course do not know whether you will succeed in giving the astrolabe to da Gama. If you do, it will most likely end up in a museum in Portugal. And if you have removed reference to it from my book, then my colleague in the 21st century, João da Gama, will not search for it. Of course, if Vasco da Gama does not donate it to a museum, but instead passes it on to another Portuguese mariner, then it will remain forever lost. So that's really how she finds out that the past that her father knew was not the present that she lives in right then. So she decides that she has to approach da Gama and offer him the astrolabe to sort of get rid of it, and hopefully he will accept it as a marine navigation device. So she talks a fisher captain into allowing her to be rowed out to the place where his fleet, where da Gama's fleet has in fact been anchored. And this is a historical truth that on January 2nd, 1499, he in fact did, on his return from India, he did drop anchor right offshore Mogadishu, but he saw a whole bunch of mosque minarets and a big city and high-rise buildings even in 1500. And he was reticent, shall we say, to go in and to port and try to, do some trade or whatever. So he stayed offshore. So I'm going to read this section where Alessandra encounters him and offers him the astrolabe. As promised, on the night of January 2nd, 1499, Afonso had his crew colorfully decorate the large, partially covered fishing boat and place lanterns all around. He was surprised to see Father Rodrigo come walking onto the dock with Alessandra. I should say that Alessandra had talked Father Rodrigo into returning to Portugal because he was an elderly priest in Mogadishu. He wanted to go home. So the priest was carrying baggage as if he were about to embark on a voyage. Alessandra was carrying something large covered by a sheet. Accompanying them were two of the priest's servants, each carrying two ossuaries. Those were the bones of the parents of Beatrice and Alessandra. They're going to be reinterred in a church in Portugal, hopefully. So the owner of the boat says to the priest, "Father, it looks like you're going on a voyage. Don't tell me you're going to join Vasco da Gama's voyage home." "Yes, that's exactly what I hope to do. I retired from the church and will live out the rest of my days in Oporto, where I was born." Father Rodrigo was carrying a large cross. The crew secured the cross upright in the bow of the boat, backlit by lanterns. The crewmen took the priest's bags and the ossuaries and placed them inside the cabin. Alessandra sat next to them, holding the covered astrolabe on her lap. Father Rodrigo stood at the bow next to the backlit cross. It was just after 11 p.m. and a bright full moon floated above them in a cloudless sky. The crewmen began rowing the boat out of the harbor. About an hour after they passed the last pier, they were astonished to see da Gama's ship, the São Gabriel, and the other ships at anchor. When their boat approached the São Gabriel, Father Rodrigo loudly hailed the ship in Portuguese. When an astonished sailor appeared at the side of the São Gabriel, Father Rodrigo announced himself. "I am Father Rodrigo, pastor of the Santo Condestable Catholic Church in Mogadishu. I and one of my parishioners wish to have an audience with Captain Vasco da Gama." The sailor stepped back, walked to the captain's cabin, and informed the captain. Cautious and suffering from insomnia, da Gama stepped outside his cabin and walked to the side of the ship. He was astonished at the sight of the brightly lit fishing boat. He immediately ordered a rowboat uncovered. The captain was about to board it when his Arabic interpreter, João Perez, approached. "Captain, if you don't mind, I would like to accompany you. I will be armed in the event there is treachery." The captain agreed and they boarded the fishing boat. Two of the captain's crewmen rowed the boat next to the garishly decorated fishing boat. Alessandra had come outside holding the astrolabe. Standing on the other side of the cross from Father Rodrigo, she said, "Captain da Gama, we are honored that your ships have anchored here. I am Alessandra Fuente, a native of this city. My priest at Mogadishu Santo Condestable Church, Father Martin Rodrigo, is here with me. The reason for our visit with you is this." Holding up the astrolabe, she continued, "I have inherited this very valuable maritime navigational instrument, a spherical astrolabe. I offer it to you in the hope that it will enable you to return home to Portugal safely." Alessandra reached across the gap between the two boats and handed the astrolabe to the captain. Da Gama held it up and examined it from several angles. After almost a minute, he said, "I'm astounded at the magnificence of this machine. I am aware of these, but our fleet left Portugal before one could be obtained. We were forced to use charts and an ancient, simpler astrolabe." Looking up from the astrolabe, he asked, "But why are you giving me this valuable instrument?" "I'm giving it to you on behalf of my deceased father, Horacio Alexander Fuente. He was a respected historian here in Mogadishu who specialized in the Portuguese explorations on behalf of the crown. A visiting merchant from Malindi told us of your visit there last April and that your fleet intended Calcutta as your destination. I hope my father's spherical astrolabe will ensure your safety on the trip home and on many trips thereafter. Da Gama handed the spherical astrolabe to Mr. Perez and said, I thank you very much, milady. He began to turn away when Perez said something to the captain in a low voice. The captain turned back to Alessandra and said, Mr. João Perez, one of my ship's officers, would like to ask you a few questions. Mr. Perez asked Alessandra in Arabic, Miss Fuente, have you lived in Mogadishu all your life? Alessandra was stunned to hear Arabic come out of this Portuguese man's mouth. She answered in Arabic, you surprise me, sir. I did not expect to hear a Portuguese sailor speak the language of Mogadishu and the Middle East. But the answer to your question is, I have not lived here all of my life. I was born and raised here, but attended the University of Padua for 5 years. After I graduated, I accepted the offer to teach, and I taught for 36 years and recently retired. Now it was Perez's turn to be surprised. Switching to Portuguese, he said, Padua, how did you manage to do that? What subjects did you teach? I taught Arabic, English, and astronomy. First, you surprised me with your fluency in Arabic, which I admit I thought to prove you to be an Arab rather than Portuguese. Now you surprise me by speaking perfect Portuguese and saying you taught English. How did you learn English? Surely there are no English speakers in Mogadishu. You are correct. After my father died, I'm the only English speaker left, but from a young age, my father had insisted that I study English as a tutor, with a tutor. So I'll stop there, and just the end result is that the admiral did accept the astrolabe. He also allowed the priest to come on board and become the priest for the ship, for the fleet, because they had none, and they thought that this was sort of a sign from God. Now, so I'll jump ahead a little to the point where the next part of her task, her next task that her father asked her to complete was to get rid of his memoir, to turn it in so that it would be taken by Ahmed Gran, and then he would use it as a talisman because he was a very superstitious general. And this is all true. This is based on the historical record. So they decide they're going to, they have talked two of their friends who are, one is the captain of a caravel that is temporarily docked at Mogadishu for repairs. And the other man is his first mate. The first mate's name is Ibrahim, and the captain is Negasi. Negasi is an Ethiopian man, and Ibrahim is, I guess you would say, an Ethiopian Jew who grew up in the central part of Ethiopia. So they've decided they're going to go horseback up to this city called Zela, where there is a big mosque, and they know from the historical record that that's where Ahmed Gran has arisen, and that's where he will then gather his forces and proceed to attack Abyssinia. So that's where they decide they're going to to deposit the memoir. So here we go. Ibrahim and Negasi had the horses saddled before dawn. The two other members of the riders, as Beatrice decided they would call themselves, showed up a few minutes later, carrying the things they would put in the saddlebags. Negasi and Ibrahim were about to put the rifles in narrow leather scabbards when Beatrice said, "They look shorter than I remember seeing them in the firearm shops. Did you modify them?" Ibrahim said, "No, they were already modified by local craftsmen. We wanted the shorter version of the espingarda because it will be strapped above the saddlebags aimed back to front." Negasi said, "Strapped like this, Ibrahim and I will be able to pull them out of the scabbard quickly without having to dismount. They're loaded and ready to fire." Alessandra tried to hide her grimace. When Beatrice finished stowing her gear in her saddlebags, she said, "Wow, I was worried about the amount of stuff I wouldn't be able to fit in my bags, but I'm pleasantly surprised. Alessandra said she had the same reaction. I love how these horses are so calm while we're loading the saddlebags on their backs. Nagasi said they're used to carrying much more. They're post carriers. Remember, post carriers are the horses that would go sort of like the Pony Express in the West. The same thing existed in the Middle East in those days. Ibrahim walked around each horse and checked the saddles and stirrups. When he was satisfied, he said, well, it looks like we're ready to ride out. Beatrice, I suggest you lead since you know the city better than Nagasi and I. I'll ride behind you. Alessandra behind me and Nagasi at the rear. Once we're clear of the city and in open country, I'll take the lead since I know the countryside pretty well. With that, everyone mounted and urged their horses slowly forward and out to the street. From there, they increased their pace gradually. The city was still asleep, except for the bakers who were pulling their loaves out of the ovens and setting them on cooling racks. At the end of the day, they found a place to camp. And I'll just summarize that particular situation. What happened then, they had stopped to let the horses graze and to drink from a stream they were crossing. Alessandra shaded her eyes and pointed to movement in the distance. What do you suppose that is, Nagasi? I see some sort of flock and maybe some figures on horseback. Nagasi said, yes, I saw them just before we stopped. We should proceed slowly to avoid surprising them. They might be simple pastoralists, or they might be pastoralists commissioned by the Ajuran Sultanate to keep watch over the border. If it's the latter, let me do the talking. If any of the rest of you is asked questions, do not speak Portuguese. Speak Arabic or Somaliña. I'll give my name as Jamal. Alessandra, if you're asked for your name, you are Leila. Beatrice, you are Amina. Each of you should cover your head with a scarf. The group set out again, this time very slowly. Eventually, they were approached by a rider who had detached himself from the other two men guarding the flock of sheep. He was wearing the green colors of the Sultanate and was armed. He reined in his horse, withdrew his rifle, and placed it across his saddle. I must ask you your business and where you are headed. Pointing to Nagasi, he said, what are your names? My name is Jamal. This is my brother Ibrahim and my wives Leila and Amina. We are headed for Zela. The soldier looked at each of them and said to Nagasi, what is your business in Zela? My wife Leila's parents are buried at the Masjid al-Qiblatain. We're going to pray for the progress of their souls. The soldier looked skeptical. I think you must be coming from Mogadishu. What is your business there? Ibrahim started to speak, but the soldier silenced him. I'm not asking you, I'm asking your brother. Jamal, answer my question. Nagasi said, I am first mate of the Caravel Mythos. Ibrahim is chief engineer. Our captain ordered the ship into dry dock for at least 3 weeks. My wives live in Mogadishu with my elderly mother. We decided to take advantage of the time to ride overland to Zela. The soldier seemed to run out of questions for the moment. Then there was a shout from the other two men watching the sheep. Nagasi said, it looks like some of the animals are looking for greener pasturage. The soldier turned his horse around and said, I must return. Go on your way and give my respects to Imam Abdullah. So that was a fairly close call. They ended up making their way to Zela, and after a long series of negotiations and some adventures, they managed to locate the mosque and deposit the book, the memoir, which had been heavily edited already, so that it removed all references to time travel in the future and all of that stuff. So I guess I'll stop talking, and unless people have questions, I'll answer your questions and go from there.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to do the research to put all that together?
Well, It took me probably a little over maybe 2.5 years probably to do the research. I had already, like I said before, I had lived in the region. I was familiar. I had never been to Somalia, but I knew people. I taught in my Peace Corps days. I taught with some English teachers who were Somali, who were living in Asmara, because I lived in Asmara my second year of Peace Corps.
Oh, okay.
So I learned about it starting then, and then I did a lot of research after that. And that's how it came together. And like I said, I had taken a stab at the story early on. I wrote a shorter version that I was not satisfied with. And so I took it all apart and redid it.
Yeah. That was my next question, was the dovetailing of your research with this incredible futuristic, back and forth time travel thing. So
Right.
you had already written, what'd you say, a novella about that, and then you did more work on it.
Right. I had written a novella that ultimately I had the germ of an idea, but I wasn't satisfied with a lot of the elements of the story. So I took it and I disassembled it, and I had some other plot ideas and I expanded those and deleted some others, and I still had the same idea of a group of retired history professors from Hawaii
Uh-huh.
finding this device and the book, which at that point, when they found it, they found the book and the device. The book had not been edited to remove all the description of time travel and how to convert these machines into time machines. So Alessandra, toward the middle of the book, when her father leaves her that letter, she realizes she has to edit the book because you don't want to create this time travel loop. I mean, of course, time travel, right? I mean, we're assuming that in the world of time travel, you don't want a loop like that because it'll just keep going on and on and on. So you want it to end, you want to terminate it. And so that's what Alessandra does. She
Uh,
terminates it so that in the future, when they come upon this book, it will be just a memoir.
yeah, yeah,
So that took me a long time to try to figure out how in the hell am I going to, avoid this kind of loop idea.
yeah,
But it was a lot of fun to give it a try.
yeah.
And the prequel, I should say, the one that I originally started and then abandoned, and that turned into the sequel. The prequel I have rewritten and I've submitted it. It's basically it's like a 50-page novella, I guess you would call it. And I've submitted it to a science fiction magazine, and I'm waiting to hear. I think by next month I will hear
Uh-huh,
yay or nay, whether they publish it or not.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
I have one more question. Did you have a number of readers as you were going through the process of putting this together, and how much editing was required for you to publish it?
The first version of it, my wife read it, and she kind of gave me her unvarnished opinion of it, and and we had some discussions about it. I didn't really send it out to a bunch of people like I did my first novel. I had written a novel called Stolen Identity, and that I sent around several times, several versions of it to probably half a dozen people who read it, gave me their opinions and such. And so this time I felt like I knew enough of the subject matter, which was the region, and I knew the characters very well, having written the shorter version already.
Uh-huh.
So I just went with it, and that was that. Mhm. Hmm. No other questions? Looks like my cat has a question back there. His name is Freddie.
He's joining the group.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a little late.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's basically it. The end of I have an appendix at the end that has an entry from Vasco da Gama's, I guess you would call him a secretary. He actually, he wrote an extensive journal of their voyages. And so I included the excerpt where the man describes their dropping anchor at Mogadishu and then traveling on further down East Africa to the other ports. So I included that there because I found it really interesting to read this sailor's description of the process of, the kinds of experiences that they went through. And, the Portuguese were really brutal explorers. I mean, they if it wasn't them, it would have been the Spanish, or it would have been some other European power that would have explored and exploited Africa and
Yeah.
India and, but as it was, the Portuguese enslaved a lot of people. They demolished a lot of coastal communities. They did make some treaties on the east coast of Africa, and there was peace there. Mainly, they made treaties with very powerful kingdoms that they didn't want to fight.
Mhm.
But whenever they encountered other communities that they could exploit, they did so. So it was a very brutal time.
Did you think of the prequel after or before you wrote your main novel?
Well, like I said, I wrote this, I guess you would call it a novella, which turned out to be the prequel. I was unhappy with, it was rather superficial, and I didn't have a real clear idea of how to deal with the paradox that might occur when you're talking about sending something back to the future. So I sort of took that apart and gave it some thinking, and then and rewrote it from there. And then after I came out with this, Around the Horn and Back, I rewrote the prequel, and that's what I said. I've submitted it to a science fiction magazine, and we'll see whether they publish it or not. And even if they don't, I will probably self-publish it on Amazon.
Would you ever think about combining them? I mean, down the line, if you self-published a small novella, then
Yeah.
you could just add it on later on, could you?
Yeah, I wondered about doing that or putting them together as a package or something like that. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I did think of that.
Have you ever thought of making an imaginary map of all the places they go to from your imagination?
Well, the places they go to are real places, like Padua, University of Padua, is one of the oldest universities in Europe. It was as old as Salamanca in Spain. And it still exists. But like I said in the story, the first time they ever admitted women was in the 1700s. And even then it was some nobleman's daughter that got admitted. It wasn't like, open enrollment for women. That didn't happen for hundreds of years.
Yeah, but I would like a map to follow along.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, the map on the cover, this is a very stylized map. I don't know if you can.
Oh, yes, I can. Uh-huh.
That is that's a painting that was done by an Italian priest in Rome I guess it was in the, I don't know, 1600s or something. I can't remember.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
So does the prequel have a name?
Yeah.
What's the prequel?
It's a very creative name called the Spherical Astrolabe. Right. And, I was going to call it something, like the Starlight Commune or something, because like I said, these retired history professors had all studied the Middle East in their careers in that era. And they were they would love to actually fill the gap, because there is a big academic gap of Western literature dealing with the history of Mogadishu and Somalia, because, you know, people may have written about it, but it didn't survive. There were two Arab travelers in the 1300s, about 50 years apart, who traveled all around the region, and they kept extensive journals, and they wrote descriptions of the places they visited, you know, from, you know, I guess they started out in Morocco and went all the way to India. But when they got to Mogadishu, they just described it as, you know, it's a city with many multi-story buildings and several beautiful mosques and some schools. And the people are very rustic. I mean, that's about all they said. So, you know, there isn't a whole lot of you know, primary source work on Somalia and Mogadishu in the 1500s.
So when they make the movie,
Yeah, that's right.
should we watch the prequel first, or?
That's a good question. I have a friend who is a movie maker, a filmmaker, Paul Curiazzi. I have been hitting on Paul for months to get him to consider this. He says, "Oh no, there's too many characters. There's too many locations. I can't, you know, I can't go on ship and do this and this, you know."
Well, that's why you get a screenwriter to
Yeah.
Yeah.
pare it down or something.
Okay. Well, I'll hire you, Lorraine. How's that?
I
Yeah.
have a lot of experience with screenwriting, for sure.
Okay. Well, any other questions? I don't want to keep you up past your bedtime. I know. That's,
So is this book is available on Amazon? Is that correct?
yes, it is available on Amazon. That's right. And along with the other books that I've written are there, and some shorter books, some novellas are there too.
Do you have copies at the railway
Yeah.
depot?
Yes, I did. I dropped some off of a couple months ago, right, Irene?
Yes. And
Yeah.
if you want it to be inscribed, we can arrange that. So I can mail it to you and just call the bookstore and we'll make it happen for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm
Great.
quite, I love coming back to my hometown and, you know, going to the New Mecca restaurant and having Mexican food, and, or the Great Italian restaurant that's up the street. So I would love to do that. Okay. So I
Thank you,
guess,
Michael.